Okay, this works. That's off. Okay. Yeah, I think the battery's almost dead. All right, we got the. So my name is Glen, if you haven't heard, and I'm with the Wisconsin Pathfinders. One thing with the Pathfinders, people ask, what is, well, first of all, there is a worksheet. I'm going to have someone pass out, make sure everyone's got a worksheet and a pen. People sometimes ask, what is Pathfinders? And I tell them that, or some people might say, Pathfinders is like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, but instead of earning badges, they earn something called honors. And that's kind of true. We do that. We have various honors you can earn for athletic things and camping and skills and those kinds of things. But I will tell you, Pathfinders, we have an ulterior motive. We're not just trying to make our kids better citizens for this country in this world. We're trying to make our kids better citizens for the kingdom. And everything that we do is centered around getting kids to know Jesus and living a life. So that's kind of what we do. So this is an honor you're going to learn today. And I would suggest that you write this down. You fill in the worksheet as we go along. I can tell you that other folks is, I'm not going to do that. And they wind up halfway through deciding that they did want to do it. And then they spend the rest of the time trying to catch up. And so they want to see my notes afterwards to fill in their worksheet and so forth. So I would suggest to you just fill it in. If you do fill it in, you're welcome to talk to the Pathfinder staff, and they can get you a little patch for a nice donation, I would imagine, right? So I think they're trying to get to Gillette. But even without a donation, I have had, this is not the first time I've preached this sermon, and I have had lots of people come up and say that, wow, they really learned a lot and about how they deal with other people. We're talking about dealing with conflict. And so regardless of what your experience is, and I think there's something we all can learn from this. So that's what we're here today. This is called Peacemakers. And I think the clicker still works. Yeah. And this is actually an honor, skill level 1. It's been around since 2009. And it really deals with, how to deal with conflict. Did anybody have some conflict going on in your life? You don't have to raise your hand because I know that all of you do because you're humans. We live on this sinful earth. All right. So make sure everyone has a worksheet and everyone has something to write with. If you don't have it, raise your hand. All right. Everybody's got one? Okay. Here we go. So first of all, are there any teachers in this? Any teachers? What's your name? Yvonne. Okay. Yvonne, since you're the teacher, I want you to know this is not school, okay? So we're allowed to cheat, and it's not like a test, okay? So do not give anybody a flunking grade if they copy off my answers. I'm going to tell you what my answers are. You can fill in your own answers, but I'm going to tell you what I filled in for my answers, and you can fill it in as we go along, okay? So again, Yvonne, this is not school, so do not flunk anybody, okay? You promise? All right. So you guys can copy off of me and not worry about getting flunking. All right. So I'm going to ask you a question, word association. When I say conflict, what does that mean to you? Yell out some words. Conflict. Trouble. What else? Disagreement. What else? War. What else? Pain. Arguments. Yeah. So you're like me, where I have a cheap dictionary. The cheap dictionary has these kind of definitions. Conflict, a fight, battle, or struggle, especially prolonged struggle. So like Vietnam, we did not officially declare war, so it was technically not a war. We call it the Vietnam conflict. But you know what? It looked like a war, tasted like a war, smelled like a war. It was a war, but we don't call it a war, but we call it the conflict. That's another name for a war. Controversy, quarrel, conflicts between parties. This happens all the time in the legal situation. You go to court to settle conflicts between you and your neighbor or you and whoever that you may be sued or being sued that you are suing. Those are conflicts that the legal profession helps us get through. Discord of action, feeling or effect, antagonism or opposition as the interest of principles, a conflict of ideas. So we have conflicts between the political parties. You got the political left, political right. I'm about sick of hearing about political left and political right. But those are conflicts. It seems like we just, tried to make those conflict. A striking together, collision. I spent 5 hours driving here this morning. Thank you, Jesus. I did not have a conflict on the way here. And nice that I don't think I saw anybody else have conflicts. But that can really turn nasty. I don't want conflicts there. Incompatibility, interference, as one I did to desire activity with another, a conflict in schedule. If you call me and tell me you want to meet with me Thursday at 3:00, I might look at my Outlook calendar at my work and I say, sorry, I can't meet with you then because I have a conflict in my schedule. Psychiatric, mental struggle arising from opposing demands or impulses. We all know folks, or at least know of folks that have internal conflicts. They've got those demons arguing with each other inside. That I'm glad that not all of us have, but there are some people that really struggle with that. So those are the internal conflicts. So again, this is the cheap definition of what conflicts is. What this honor is intended to tell you is that there is actually two kinds of conflicts. There's bad conflict and there's good conflict. And we need to realize when we're in the bad conflict and how we can convert that to the good conflict. Okay, so we can start filling out your worksheets now. Bad conflict is what we call catabolic conflict, catabolic. So if you're maybe into dietitian kinds of stuff, you've probably heard of catabolic kinds of things. That basically means that your body has the ability to break down nutrients or whatever. So break down. So catabolic is bad because it's breaking things down. On the other hand, there's something called good conflict, or we call anabolic conflict. Anabolic, it's again another biology term. So if anybody ever heard the term anabolic steroids, not necessarily a good thing, but that means that they help build your muscles. It's building up things. So again, catabolic is tearing things down, which is the bad conflict. And the good conflict is the anabolic, and that's what we're really trying to get to. Okay, so I made a comment a little bit ago about politics. So I'm going to start off by telling everyone that I consider the pulpit just to bring people to Jesus. Okay, it doesn't tell us how to vote, but it does give good illustrations. So if you can't discuss politics without getting really upset, just duck your head and we'll tap you when this is over. I'm going to do everything I can to make this as apolitical as possible, but I do want to talk about something because it helps illustrate a point. Okay, everybody's been warned, so nobody's going to get upset, right? All right. Okay, question. Is this anabolic or catabolic conflict? Catabolic, capital C, capital A, capital T, capital letters all the way across, catabolic conflict. This picture, if you don't recognize it, this is from the debate for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. One of the questions I remember most from this debate, they asked them, can you say something nice about your opponent? Both candidates really, really struggled with that question. And they weren't alone. Americans really struggled with that question. In fact, I saw some statistics. This is the first election ever that was really kind of different, and it looks like it's a trend. But traditionally, every party, Republican or Democrat, they get 30% more or less of the vote because they're always going to vote Republican or they're always going to vote Democrat. And the people in the middle, so that's 30, 60, the 40% in the middle, if you will, they say, I like him, but I like him a little bit better. So like Obama, we elected Obama, but people generally like John McCain, unless you were a hardcore Democrat, but people generally like John McCain and they just preferred Obama. Mitt Romney, good guy. Most people thought Mitt Romney was a good guy, but most people preferred Obama. Before that, it was Bush. People liked Bush a little bit better than Al Gore. Al Gore's, probably a nice guy, would be a nice neighbor and so forth. John Kerry, again, seems to be a nice guy, and people just chose the one that they liked better. But in this election, the polls showed that more than 50% of the people didn't like him, and more than 50% of the people didn't like her. So this is the first election where we basically went, I don't like him, I don't like her, and the people in the middle held their nose, and they picked him. And then I tried to research to find the polls for the last election, but my personal opinion is happened again. I think people didn't like him and didn't like him, and they held their nose, and that's why we have who we are. So anyway, it's getting worse and worse in this country is the point I'm trying to make. Okay, another political question. you think there's anabolic or catabolic conflict in this picture? Anybody know what this is? This is President Biden when he first got elected, and this is his cabinet. You can tell because the time they were all wearing masks, 6 foot, so forth. So a lot of those people are probably gone. But do you think there's catabolic or anabolic conflict in these meetings? Yeah, I have no idea because I don't get invited to those meetings. I can't tell you. But we should, regardless if you're an R or a D, you should be praying that there's lots of conflict in those meetings, because what you don't want to have happen is what happened in this picture. Does anybody reckon? Any Pathfinders had history? Does anybody Pathfinders know what this picture is? Yeah, so I heard some adults. It's Kennedy. Yeah, so this is President Kennedy with his cabinet. You can see Lyndon Johnson there on the left. He was vice president at the time. So if you were to stop 1,000 people, 1,000 Americans on any city street and say, we're going to build a new Mount Rushmore, can you pick the top 4 or the top 5 presidents that we've ever had that go on the mountain? Most people, Kennedy would probably get enough votes to be on that mountain, which is odd because I've read a lot of history books and so forth, and all the history books say that while Kennedy was in office, horrible. He was not going to get reelected. Kennedy did lots of good things. He did lots of things to get us forward in civil rights. He wished us to the moon and back and so forth. So he did a lot of good things. But at the time, he was not going to get reelected. And I'm not going to go into details, but if you don't understand that, you can look up Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, and so forth. So he had us in some things that most Americans didn't like. In fact, some of the history books I read with the Secret Service, they said that they begged him not to go to Dallas, but he was in full-blown campaign mode because all the polls said he was going to lose, and they begged him not to go into open. But again, he was in open campaign mode. But interesting enough, the biographies that I've read anyway don't blame Kennedy. I guess you could, because he appointed all the people in this room, but they blame the people in this room as to all the bad things that happened during his administration. These were what they call yes men. There was no conflict in these meetings. They basically, the president would say something about whatever, and there was nobody in the room to challenge him on it. They would say, yes, sir, we'll get that done. There should have been somebody to stand up and said, Mr. President, are you sure it's a good idea to invade Cuba? Mr. President, are you sure it's a good idea to start sending troops to Vietnam? Those kinds of, and there was nobody in that room to do that. And so most people blame the people. So the point is, we all understand that bad conflict is bad. Catabolic conflict is bad. But the point is that no conflict can be almost as bad as catabolic conflict. We should really strive to push everything towards a good conflict. Okay? All right. That's enough about politics. If you have anybody of your neighbors that are in the fetal position on the pew, you can tap them and wake them up here. We're going to go back to the Bible. And so the honor asked us to look at some specific Bible text. So as we go through here today, you're going to see Bible text up on the screen, and some of them are in your packet. If you don't know the story, you can look it up when you get home, because we're going to start flying through a lot of Bible stories. So we want to talk about Acts 15, 1 through 20. What is that story? So again, I want to tell you what I wrote on my sheet. If you come up with something different, by the way, you can pat yourself on the back so everybody can know that you came up with something different. But so Acts 15 through 1 through 12 is a story about conflict over circumcision. Conflict over circumcision. So the question is, how does this story illustrate catabolic conflict? So the story goes is that there were some people in Judea, Jews, who had some concerns about some new Christians in a town called Antioch. And the people from Judea said, you know what, those people over in Antioch, those Christians, they're not Jewish enough. They're not Jewish enough. We need to fix that. So it started some catabolic conflict. They were trying to find differences, and they went out to set them straight, because they needed to understand how to be Jewish in their Christian faith. So that was the catabolic conflict. That's what I wrote. So the question is, how does this story illustrate anabolic conflict? So in verse 6, it gave me some insight. It says the apostles and elders met to consider the question. So they got together to talk about it. And as part of that discussion, they prayed, they talked to God about it also. And they figured out that God knew the heart. So they basically came out of this. They said, you know what? Here's what's really important, because they after the discussion, talking about it, listening to what each other had to say, that was the anabolic part of the equation. So again, here's a story. It started out catabolic conflict. That could have turned really nasty. Anybody know of any bad stories about Christians getting together and things don't always turn out the best in the discussions? That's never happened here, I'm sure, but most other Christian churches have that issue, and that's what happened here. So they got together because there's a difference of opinion, and they actually had to consider each other's opinion when they finished up the issue. Next story they want us to look at is 1 Corinthians 12 through 31. What is this story about? So I put down unity and diversity in one body. This is where it says, you know, so the catabolic conflict, the foot says, hey, I want to be the hand, or the ear says, hey, I want to be the eye, and maybe the eye says to the hand, you know what, I don't need you anymore. That happens sometimes in our churches, right? And so, verse 25, how does this passage illustrate anabolic conflict? Equal concern for each other. Paul says to have equal concern for each other. I'll say it again. Have equal concern for each other. Rejoice together. So so my passion is Pathfinders. And I don't know anything about your church board meetings, but I would suspect that there's probably conflict in your church board meetings. And I've been part of plenty of church board meetings where somebody may say, hey, how come I need some help? I need 20 people next weekend, and you guys didn't come help me, something like that. Well, Paul tells us, you know what? You do you. And he says, whatever God calls you to do it. Do it to the best. So my passion is Pathfinders. If you want to join me and help me in Pathfinders, I'm going to welcome you. Come join me. But if you're not, if your passion happens to be, nutrition or feeding the homeless or something like that, power to you. I'm going to stand on the sidelines. I'm going to follow Paul's advice. I'm going to cheer you on. But quite honestly, don't ask me to come, because Pathfinders takes up a lot of my time. That's where God put my passion. And if Pathfinders is not your passion, I appreciate that. But you have to have some kind of passion that God wants you to do whatever. So imagine if we all worked on our passion. Imagine how big our churches would be, right? But sometimes we get mad because my passion is not your passion, and I get mad because other people aren't joining me doing my passion. So that's the story I learned from that. The next story the honor wants us to talk about is Genesis 13, 1 through 12. This is Abram and Lot. So the catabolic conflict is verse 7, where Abram's family and flocks were getting so big, and Lot's family and flocks were getting so big, and they started quarreling between the camps because they were all trying to occupy the same space. And they got too crowded, and they were starting to fuss, and people were fighting with each other, and you're in our way kind of thing. So the anabolic conflict is where Abram started a negotiation. He basically went to Lot, and he goes, look left, look right. Whichever one you pick, I'll go the other way. And Lot, of course, chose the one with Sodom and Gomorrah. In hindsight, he probably wishes he picked the other side, but that was how Abram basically settled. He says, you know what? Either side's good for me. You pick whichever one you want. It's a compromise. Let's be gone. So again, we had some catabolic conflict, and they were able to turn that into anabolic conflict. They were building each other up. So you go your way, and you can let your stuff thrive, and I'll go my way, and we can thrive our flocks too. All right. So I'm going to call young lady up to help me answer the next question. James 4, 1 through 3. The question is, what does this say about catabolic conflict? So I'm going to let her read this.
It says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly and spend it on your passions.
So why does it say that we have catabolic conflict?
I think it's because humans have selfish desires.
Exactly. Good answer. Thank you. So yeah, our selfish desires. That's really tough. This is not the first time I've preached this sermon, and I will tell you that. So I write down my notes. I notes, and hopefully you just had to do it once, and so I've got it. So the next time somebody wants me to preach, I don't have to recreate everything. At my house, I tend to put things away by leaving it where I left it. That's where I know where it's at. My wife tends to put things away by putting them away where nobody can find them. This is my version. She's not here to defend herself. So, she'll stick it in a drawer, in a box, sometimes a suitcase, and stick it in the basement or wherever. And good luck finding it. At least for me to find it, because I didn't put it away. I don't know where it is. So the second or third time I had to do this sermon, it's like I cannot find my notes. My wife had put them away somewhere. That time, I don't yell, I don't hit on my wife or anything like that, but your blood pressure starts to get higher. Anybody else? You guys don't have to raise your hand, but maybe it's just me. But your blood pressure starts to get a little high. It's like, can't believe, you're gritting your teeth and that kind of thing. And I'm sitting here doing it. And my wife happens to walk by and say something. And it's like, I'm doing this because I can't find my notes. Where'd you stick them? I don't know. You look. And wherever she told me to look, I'd looked already, that kind of thing. And so as I'm sitting there, just my blood pressure's, you can feel your body getting different, And right on my screen is this screen right here, James 4:1-3, evil desires. I said, you know what? Is it my selfish? Am I being selfish? It's part of our I feel some, catabolic conflict going on here. And it's like, my wife wants our house to look halfway decent when people come to visit. She doesn't want papers here, papers there, and so forth. I said, my evil desire of wanting things where I can find them is conflict with her desires of wanting the house to look nice. So, when you realize you're the problem, humans, we have a very good talent of forgiving ourselves because we understand what our motives were, right? But we don't. It's hard for us to really understand the motives of somebody else, or at least to empathize with their issues. But once we realize our issues, and it's like, okay, so now I realize, oh, that's my fault. It's at least 50%, if not more percent of my fault, because I left my papers out. I get it. My blood pressure goes back down, and you can actually feel yourself actually calm comes over you, kind of thing. So when you this verse has new meaning for me. So when you realize, whenever you feel like you're in conflict, I always try to ask myself, I don't always do this, I grant you, but I always try to do this. I think about, how am I being selfish? How are my selfish desires causing to this issue? And a lot of times I can, have to claim some of the responsibility. I get that. All right. This next part's a lot of writing. Oh, okay. So this honor kind of discusses something called the Peacemaker. It's a book by Ken Sande. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It's very good. One of the previous times I did this sermon, a family told me they actually bought this book and actually used it as their family devotions, and they really got quite a bit out of it. So we're going to discuss this. There's a concept that this book talks about. It's called the slippery slope. So you guys are in Wisconsin, Minnesota. You understand, you have big piles of snow. Did you guys ever play King of the Mountain when you were little? Yeah. So King of the Mountain, you stand on top, and, people try to take over your position up on top, and you push them down, and you start sliding down the side. It's tougher to get back to the top. Well, this book illustrates the fact that we're really on a slippery slope. We've got a lot of conflict going on. We're going to talk about what these are, but these are catabolic conflicts and anabolic. God is telling us He wants us to be on top of this slope. But once you start falling off the slope, it gets harder and harder to get back up. So the whole concept, and I'll say this a couple times, try to realize where you are when conflict happens to you, and try to get yourself back up to the top. So we're going to talk about how to do that. So write these down. So the escape responses. So in one section are called escape responses. And I know these are tough to read, so I'll spell them out for you. Escape responses, and we'll go over these, but suicide, SUICIDE. And if you don't get all these, you can copy them after the sermon. So suicide is the first one, SUICIDE. Then we have flight, FLIGHT. And then we have denial, DENIAL. Okay. So the middle part are what we call the other side is what we call attack responses. So the attack responses are murder, MURDER, litigation, LITIGATION, and assault, ASSAULT. And the middle section, which is where we want to be, is in the peacemaking responses. The overlook, OVERLOOK, reconciliation, RECONCILLATION, negotiation, NEGOTIATION, mediation, MEDIATION, arbitration, ARBITRATION, and the last one's accountability, ACCOUNTABILITY. So we're going to go back and forth the slides. So if you didn't get them all, you can probably still have a few more minutes to see them. And again, if you don't get them, don't worry. At the end, you can look at my list. But this is important because when this next week, especially as you realize that you are in conflict, you can actually look at this list and figure out where you are on the chart. Okay, so I'll explain that a little bit. So the honor, I want you to know a little bit about the slope. So the slope, it goes from private to public. So if you notice on one side, on the very far side, there's suicide, which is something happens to me. That's a private thing that I do. And on the other side, murder. That's something you do. So again, we go from private to public. And then we also go from voluntary to forced. So again, if you look at the chart, there's flight, which means free to go. You're really free to go. That's something you can do voluntarily. But litigation, that's where you're forced to do something. Courts are making you go to court or sit down with somebody and discuss something. So again, it goes from voluntary to forced. And then we also go from defensive to antagonistic, ANTAGONISTIC. So we have something like denial, which is nuh-uh, that's kind of defensive. Nuh-uh, not me. Antagonistic, assault, which means I'm going after you. Okay, you understand the difference. So it goes from defensive to antagonistic. So that goes from one side to the other. And also notice that it goes from the most extreme losses, the extreme responses are the greatest loss. Extreme responses are the greatest loss. So, suicide and murder, those are permanent. That's game over. No more life on this earth. Game done. The worst things happen on the far ends. And so the idea, again, that's why it's important to stay in the middle of this chart. We also have the end focus on me to you. Me to you. So, for example, we have overlook to accountable. Overlook. So something that focuses on me, I'm going to overlook that to you, which means you can hold it accountable. Okay? And then also the middle focus is on us. Middle focus is on us. So if you look at the chart, it's negotiation, mediation. That's something in the middle that you do together. Okay? All right. So if you didn't get these, you can look at my notes afterwards. So that's the adult version. So that's the one book of the adult version. But we're actually going to focus on the kid version. And I'm not sure if I brought them in, but I've actually got both of these books. we're actually going to spend the time actually talking about the kid version of this. So um, the lady's name is Corlette Sandy. So this is Ken's wife. She actually wrote a parallel book for kids. If you have kids at home or you happen to be a teacher, highly recommend this. It's got a lot of good activities. So obviously you don't talk about suicide, murder, those kinds of things, but they're things that kids typically deal with. And so there's less categories. We'll go through them, but run away, blame, game, deny, put downs, gossip, fight, and in the middle is overlook, talk, and get help. So the honor asks us to look at each one of these categories and try to think about people in the Bible. Because I will tell you that there are 3,237 people listed in the Bible. Now, I don't know that because I've actually sat down and counted up everybody. I saw that on the internet, and I believe everything I read on the internet. But I can tell you that the 3,237 people specifically mentioned in the Bible, every single one of those people dealt with conflict. Some of those people dealt with conflict very well. Some of those people dealt with conflict very bad. Some of those people, we know about enough of them that we can see instances where they had both issues going on at the same time. Now, of those 3,237 people listed in the Bible, I will tell you that only one of those persons was perfect. And that one person had more conflict than you and I can even imagine. He dealt with conflict with, let's call it the Great Controversy. I mean, he dealt with that kind of conflict of the ages, if you will. That person dealt with conflict that we can't even begin to imagine that he had to deal with. So there are some people who live amongst us that think they can go through life here on this earth without any conflict. That's a fairy tale. We live in a sinful world, and as long as we're here, we're going to deal with conflict. So the idea is we need to look at the situations. Again, we need to realize that we're in catabolic conflict, and we're going to learn today about how to move that to the anabolic, okay? So the honor asks us to look at the different categories that Colleen printed out for us and wants to find out some examples. So again, I'm going to tell you what I wrote down, and again, you can visually pat yourself on the back if you come up with another idea as we're talking through this. So the first category we're going to talk about is the escape, and the escape is over on the far left side. So that's with the kid version, it's the runaway, the blame game, and the deny. That's in your notes that you have to do. So can you think of a denial story? I think of an example found in 1 Samuel 2, 22 to 25. Again, you can write this down and look at the story later if you're not familiar with the story. But there was this priest named Eli, and he had some kids that weren't acting really well. And people told him, they said, "Hey, Eli, your kids, they got some issues. You need to fix it." What did Eli do? He just kind of is in denial, right? He just kind of stuck his head in the sand, as we might say. He did not fully address the issue. Now, the other thing the honor asks us to do is not only think of a Bible example where this happened, but they want us to give a personal example. So this is the one part of the worksheet you cannot copy off of me, because as I look out amongst you, none of you are me. So these are things that happened to me. So I want to give you an example of a time that happened to me in my life, or when I can think of when denial happens. So where I work, I have employees. I have up to 50 employees at a time, depending on the time of year. And I will tell you that when someone says, "Hey, your employee, they're not doing something right," there have been times I said, "They'll get better." That rarely happens. It seems like things always get worse. So I've learned once you find out something's going wrong, you got to call them in right then, fix it, get them on the right path. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse and worse because it seems like it never gets better by itself. So that's my personal example is my employees. So again, you'll have to write down what your personal example is where you've dealt with denial in your life. The next one, number 9, give a biblical example of escape, the blame game. The story I think of is in Genesis 3. So you might have a better version of the Bible. So my paraphrase, God comes down and he says, "Hey, I don't want you playing in the garden. Quit playing football in my garden. Don't play football." And so God came down one time and they were playing football in the garden, and God couldn't believe it. He goes, "Adam, what are you doing?" And Adam says, "That's not my fault." And what did he do? He blamed somebody else. He blamed Eve. And Eve, she says, not my fault. What'd she do? She blamed the snake, the serpent. And then Adam says, you know what, God, in fact, it's your fault. He actually put the blame on God. He goes, you're the one who gave me this woman who made me eat this fruit or play this game. He goes, it's your fault, God. So that's a story where blame game was around. I'm blame game, blame game, blame game. That's a bad situation. So my personal example, when I was a freshman in college, I took calculus and I failed it. You know why? Because I had a bad professor. Or at least that's what I told myself for several years. It was quite a while later before I realized that, you know what, I probably had something to do with that. Yeah, there was a bunch of us in the class that all had to drop out and go down to the lower calculus class and so forth. But in reality, you know, there were lots of people in our class that actually passed it and did well in it. So, you know, I probably had something to do with that. But for the longest time, I was guilty of the blame game. It was always somebody else's fault in that issue. Number 10, question is, give a biblical example of escape. I think of the story in Jonah 1-3. So basically God says, hey, Jonah, by the way, I want you to do something. Here's where I want you to go. And so he went down to the port and he got on a ship and went the exact opposite. Last year, 2 years ago now, me and my wife, we were in Israel, and that's actually the place where Jonah hopped on the ship, if you will. They have a big statue of a whale there. It's kind of cool. But so Jonah basically went the opposite way. How did that turn out for Jonah? Did that turn out very good? No. He dealt with that in a catabolic response, didn't he? And so he went the other way. My personal example, you know, I left one of my favorite jobs ever because I couldn't get along with a coworker. Instead of dealing with it and making things better, I just decided to pick up and leave and figured I could get a better job somewhere else, and that's why I left. So again, not proud of it, but that is an example that, again, you need to write down your personal example of times you've played the escape runaway game. All right. Now we're going to talk about the attack mode. So the attack is on the far right. Remember, this is something I'm doing to you. This is where you're more interested in winning than saving the relationship. When you get in this mode, you just want to win. You know, you just want to win. You don't care about, trying to save your friendship or your, romantic relationship or whatever. So the attack put down, number 11. I think about a story in Nehemiah. Nehemiah versus Sanballat, a guy named Sanballat, his arch enemy. And Sanballat brought all these people up, and they were watching the Jews try to build the walls. And they called them names. They said, ooh, you feeble Jews. What are you going to do? Bring those stones back to life? Well, look, a fox could break that wall. So I have to admit, when you read that in today's world, it seems pretty tame. But you have to remember, this is back in the day before social media. Here recently, I think we've kind of perfected the art of put downs. People seem to put things on Facebook or whatever just to entice people to reiterate and have put downs and so forth. But that's my personal example. I think of the social media issue when that puts downs. It's just they seem to be everywhere. But that's a story I could think of. I haven't seen by pat yourself on the back. So you guys think along the same stories, or you guys come up with new stories on your own? Okay. Attack, gossip, and keep in mind you can do this when you get home too. Gossip. I think about the stories in Numbers 13. This is where the spies went to scope out the land, and they came back. And the Bible says that they spread a bad report. So they basically exaggerated the size. They were, they were gossiping. How did that turn out? Not very well, huh? They had to spend more time, wandering the wilderness and so forth. So everything we've talked about so far, if you think about all these stories, things generally didn't turn out well for the when the catabolic, if you will, responses. So my personal story, there is a time when somebody did something really, 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 really bad to me. And I told pretty much everybody who I thought should know about it. I told them what this other person did to me, and I made sure people that had no business at all knowing what this other person did to me. But I made sure everyone knew about it. I'm not proud of that. But it took me a while to realize that just because it was true doesn't mean it was still gossip. That we don't realize that sometimes we think gossip is just when somebody spreads lies about you. But gossip can also mean telling stuff that people have no business doing. So I can tell you that that wasn't the best response that I had, but that's my personal example. Number 13, give a biblical example of attack, a fight. So I think of the story of Cain and Abel, and I'm going to spend some time talking about this story. God, so obviously the story where Cain kills Abel, and then God comes down and is talking to Cain and trying to talk to him after the fact. And if you read this, God says something very insightful here. He says, "But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, desires to have you, but you must rule over it." So Satan is always there trying to tempt us, trying to get us to have a bad response. He's always there trying to tempt you to get you to do something bad in response. But that's up to you. Again, I mentioned that, you live in the sinful world and you can't help that bad things happen. That's just part of the sinful world. But how you respond to those bad things is entirely up to you. God says it. He says that's totally up to you. That's on you. Bad things will happen to you, but how you respond, you can't blame anybody but yourself. You're the one that's letting Satan in the door. So I think about that. My personal example, 5th grade. That's all I'm going to say about that. I don't know why that always gets laughs. All right. Number 14, work it out. So work it out. This is the middle part. So this is commanded by God. God says, this is how I want you to handle conflict in your life. And we're going to find out that this is actually empowered by the gospel. We read about Jesus. This is how Jesus wants us to respond. And this really, the goal of this is directed towards mutually agreeable solutions. This is where we should be. Remember, this is the top of the slippery slope. This is where we want to stay in our life. So, overlook. Can you think of an overlook incident? I think about how Jesus responded in John 8. There was a lady who did some things that was quite embarrassing, and she was embarrassed about it. And there were people there rubbing her face in that, basically saying, you did something bad, and we're going to make sure everybody knows about it. Jesus said, go and sin no more. People always ask, what would Jesus say about whatever the sin du jour is? And I would suggest to you that Jesus' answers then is the same as it would be today. He would say, you know what, your sins are forgiven, but go and sin no more. Jesus and God has the opportunity to overlook what we do. But notice he says, go and sin no more. He says, quit doing it. But what you did in the past, it's in the past. I'm going to overlook that. My personal example, anybody else parents? Anybody else have kids? If you hold grudges on your kids, you probably need some parenting classes. If you're a good parent, you have the ability to overlook things. Because kids say things, they're still learning, they're still doing things. Sometimes they say things they don't mean. Sometimes they do mean it. But you have to be the bigger person. Sometimes you just have to overlook it, and you try to train them in a better way, right? So can you imagine if you did hold grudges against your kids and how that would turn out? Not very well. So the fact that you can overlook things, that's what God does for us. Why can't we do that for our kids? So I'm going to overlook that, but go and sin no more. The next is a biblical example of work it out, talk about it. So here's a story I think of. It's in 1 Samuel 25. This is David. David was out wandering around with his guys, trying to protect some people that were out there working, and Nabal was a jerk about it. And so this made David so mad. David was going to go back and get all the swords and everything. He's going to go kill all the guys, and basically a bloodbath. He was going to get even. And Abigail fortunately had a more sensible head. It's probably not the first time a wife has stepped in and said, "Forgive my stupid husband." I'm sure it won't be the last time. She stands in and says, "Forgive my stupid husband for stupid things he says and stupid things that he does." But she talked about it. She says, "Here's what's going on. Here's some food for your belly. We'll figure this out," and so forth. So that's an example where talk it out. I mean, if Abigail had not stepped in to talk about it, it would have been one of David's great sins. He would have, completely done a bloodbath on some fairly innocent guys who were just out there doing their job. Personal example, me and my wife, she's got me in the habit. We say, "My love, my love." So when you do get excited about something, when you start out, "My love," and as soon as you say "my love," it kind of reminds you that is your love. It's not worth throwing over because of, a dirty dish or whatever the issue might be. And you can talk about those kinds of things. So it just kind of reminds me to talk about things instead of just letting it settle and simmer and so forth. So number 16, give a biblical example of work it out, get help. This is a story that I think of. It's found in 1 Kings 3:16 through 28. This is where two ladies had an issue and they couldn't come to an agreement. So what did they do? They went to somebody smarter than them. They went to Solomon. He basically was, he showed how smart he was, and he was able to solve their issue. My personal example, mediation, personal and professional. I've been part of mediations. Part of the joke is, mediation makes sure, neither side is happy, but in reality, at least it comes to a mutual agreement. It's maybe not everything I wanted, but a good mediator is able to find out something that would make me happy and something that makes them happy. So I may want A and they may want B, but when we get together, the guy really talks about what our real motives are, or the lady, and can say, "You know what, maybe instead of doing A or B, why don't we do C?" Which, you can still have what you want to have happen, and you can still have what you want to have happen, and everybody's happy. That's what a good mediator would be able to do for you. So I've been part of those, and it has made a good difference, both professionally and personally. So been part of those. So the last thing, the honor asks you to, or not the last thing, but it says, how can you stay on top? How can you stay on top of that slippery slope? I think about Psalms 19:14. May the words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O God. So basically, be Christ-like. The old, what would Jesus do? How can you stay on top? How would Jesus respond to this issue? So again, this week, as you go through life, this week, next week, this month, whatever, there are going to be things that happen to you. Your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your spouse, your kids, somebody that you don't even know that you bump into at the grocery store, something like that, is going to do something and put you in conflict. And you realize that, okay, I have a choice. God tells me I have a choice of how I respond to this. So go back to that list of things, of catabolic responses, and look at that list of anabolic responses. How can I respond in an anabolic response instead of a catabolic? Because once you start falling down that slope, again, the whole idea is it's just tougher to get back up. Our whole goal is we want to be on the very top where God wants us to be. That's how we deal with each other. So the last thing you have to do to get this honor is something called reverse role play. So you can find a friend here at church. You can find your brother, your sister, or somebody on the streets, whatever. It says reverse role play a conflict from your own life and identify where you are on the slippery slope and what possible work it out options you might try. So think about a time in your life, some issue in your life where you had a catabolic issue. You maybe didn't respond the right way. Role play that with your friend or whoever you buddy up with, and kind of role play that. Talk about what you could have done differently to get yourself in that anabolic. So again, it's entirely up to you how you deal with this. God tells us that. Things are going to happen to you because, again, we live in a sinful earth. Things happen to us. Sorry. It's part of what you signed up for when you were born on this earth. And until we get to heaven, we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to figure out how to respond so we can be on top instead of on the side. So once you do that, then you can show that to the Pathfinder staff, and they can order a nice little patch for you. So, all right. That's my sermon. I hope you got a blessing out of it. I know it's not a typical sermon, but it's not typical honor either. So hopefully we did a nice blend of the two. Thank you.